welcome to this week's Cloud9Fin Syndication Nation podcast, where we unpack all things LevFin related. My name is Sasha, and I am the U.S. Deputy Editor with 9fin. And joining me today is LevFin reporter David Westenhaver, and he will be discussing his latest deep dive on Six Flags. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Sasha. Good to be here.
Likewise, first podcast, so let's get to it.
Podcast.
Yeah. So tell us about your reporting. I mean, it was a great, well-read, well-written story. I really enjoyed it. And let's give our audience a chance to have a teaser of what that includes. So tell us a bit more about your reporting. As LevFin investors already know, Six Flags did a debt refinancing earlier this year, which did fairly well, and the bonds now trade above par. So that's just one part of it, but what's the bigger story?
The bigger story is essentially that Six Flags debt investors are ready for an operational turnaround that they've been waiting for a few years now. Six Flags has a new CEO. John Riley joined the company late last year, and he's been saying all the right things. He's an industry veteran, and people are hoping that now is finally the time for a much needed turnaround for Six Flags. So they've had some operational missteps over the last decade. They've had, I believe, 8 CEOs in the last 15 years or so.
That's crazy.
When we were reporting that story in January, one buy-sider essentially said, there's a lot of things to not like about the company, but I still like it and I'm going to invest in the debt. And that was pretty par for the course in terms of what buy-siders had to say. So it's a very complicated story. There's a lot of challenges, a lot of them historic, stemming from before their merger with Cedar Fair. But they have a strategy going forward, and they've already begun to execute on that.
Cool. Yeah, and as part of that strategy, I believe that they sold off a bunch of parks as well, right? But is that enough to help their situation?
I think it's helpful in that it shows that they're executing on their plan to focus their investment on a smaller number of parks. It doesn't necessarily move the needle too much on the balance sheet. I think the sale itself moved leverage from about 6.5 to 6.4x. So rating agencies said it was leverage neutral. So the sale itself isn't going to allow them to deleverage, but it allows them to focus their CapEx on a smaller number of parks. This essentially came from a discovery that the former CEO spoke about a year ago, where he said 80% of the revenue, 90% of EBITDA came from about 15 parks out of a portfolio, which at the time was more than 40 parks.
Oh, wow.
And there was some conversation around, do we invest in these underperforming parks and try to bring them up to speed? Or do we kind of trim the fat of the portfolio and just focus the investment on the top performing parks? And investors really decided that they wanted the latter. At least when I spoke to them in January, that's what they said. And this is Six Flags essentially saying, yeah, we agree with you, and that's what we're doing.
Cool. You mentioned more than 40 parks. So that, I'm assuming, was after the merger with Cedar, right? Is that how they ended up with that much of a portfolio?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. All right. Cool. But before we unpack the Cedar Fair merger and that rocky path, I just wanted to know more about, the company's attempts at improving their customer service, because I know that some interesting stuff happened there.
Yeah, the customer experience, the main thing I got from sources was that it's not all about the roller coasters. Obviously, that's the main thing you think of when you hear the name Six Flags. And that is the main attraction. Obviously, it's very important for the business. But the criticisms of Six Flags of late haven't been about the roller coasters. It's been about things like long lines, rides breaking down, which obviously is related, but long lines because of maintenance or just poorly maintained facilities, whether that be food and beverage areas, or just the appearance of the park in general. Not that it was falling apart, but I was reading one roller coaster blog, and they said essentially, every park could use a new coat of paint. So it's a small thing, but it's a thing that can make the difference for a visitor, especially when they're considering how much to spend on a trip like this. And so John Riley, the CEO, has been adamant about improving that experience. He's spoken a lot about food and beverage investments, which is important for parents and people who are going there and spending. They've invested in technology. Apparently, they're mostly done with that kind of investment, the kind of technology that will again allow their lines to move more quickly at retail spots, at food and beverage stands, and that sort of thing. So it's kind of just greasing the wheels of the customer experience to allow it to be smoother and just more enjoyable.
Got it. Yeah, no, that does sound like he's doing a lot there.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just step back for a moment. I really want to know more about the merger of Cedar Fares. I know it's been 2 years or nearly 2 years since that happened,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not quite gone according to plan. And why is
Mm-hmm.
that?
Yeah, investors have been critical about it. I think it largely comes down to the same conversation around downsizing the parks portfolio. It's that on a park by park level, they needed investment. And so when they upsized the portfolio, it just created a larger portfolio of underinvested theme parks. And so I think there was some question about, where do we invest here? They do say that they've achieved full synergy in terms of cost savings, but at the same time, investors haven't really been convinced that all of the promised synergies have really been achieved at this point.
Got it. Six Flags also famously said that, bad weather was the reason for their financial underperformance last
Mm-hmm.
year. So how are people feeling about that?
That's a tough one because weather is a valid excuse, but at the same time, when it comes up repeatedly, investors grow frustrated and say, okay, there's more to the story here, right? Last year they did have a few bad weekends of weather, but at the same time, if that's happening repeatedly, it's more of an operational problem. They can rely heavily on some big weekends. If there's a rainy Memorial Day weekend, that's going to have an impact, but it shouldn't be enough to derail your entire year, right? That's essentially what I heard from investors. They said it happens. It's an understandable challenge, but it's one that should be able to be overcome. And so that's been a primary frustration for these investors is they've been pushing for operational improvements for some time. They've had a few different CEOs throughout that process, and a number of them have continued to blame the weather for their underperformance. And they're saying, we've heard that enough times. Let's just forget about the weather and actually perform with what we have here. So there's some impatience there, definitely.
Got it. Well, it'll be interesting to see if they use weather again as an excuse in their next earnings or next full year earnings. Also, you did mention speaking with roller coaster enthusiasts for the story, which I want to unpack a little bit. What did they say about the closure of King Ka? Why were they so upset about it?
Yeah, there's a few reasons with that. I think really it was a ride that kind of defined the Six Flags experience, and its closure was almost more symbolic of some of the challenges facing the company. So one day in 2024, the ride closed down. There was no announcement beforehand, although some observers suspected that it might be closing down soon. They never announced it. They just closed the ride. And then sometime a few weeks later, then they announced, this ride is closed for good. It's never opening up again. They demolished it the following spring. And there were some very real reasons that the ride needed to be torn down. Apparently it was very expensive and, required a lot of maintenance and upkeep. But it was also, it was a famous roller coaster that brought in visitors. And had they communicated that ahead of time, people posited that maybe some of these roller coaster enthusiasts would have made an extra trip to the park. On top of that, they promised a replacement that was going to be going up this year, but that's been delayed as well. So I think for a lot of Six Flags fans, it's just become symbolic of some of the missteps that the company has become famous for over the last decade or so.
Nice. That's good to know. And you know what, to your point about people trying to squeeze in one more trip, had they, given everyone the heads up, I think that's a good point to bring up because that's so true. So final question and the hardest one of all. After doing all of this reporting for the story, which Six Flags park would you like to visit the most and why?
I think I would say Six Flags Magic Mountain. It's one of their most famous parks. It's in California. I'm from the West Coast. It's supposed to have their best roller coaster lineup. I don't know if I have the stomach for the roller coasters nowadays, but as someone from the West Coast, it's the most legendary park. Although I have been to Knott's Berry Farms, and that one is awesome. I had a great time there as a kid, so that would be second on the list.
What's a scary one? The ones that go from the high to the low, or the upside down one?
Oh, for me, it's the wooden ones because they sound like they're going to fall apart.
Oh yeah, the creaking sound. Yeah. I did Knott's Berry Farm as a kid. I don't think I can stomach it right now.
Yeah. No, I still have nightmares about the wooden roller coaster at Knott's Berry Farm, so it was a scary one.
That's like what, 65 years old, right?
I don't know.
More than that.
It sounded
it's
very
like one
old.
of the oldest roller coasters in the country, if I'm not wrong.
know.
Don't quote me on that.
I didn't know
that's
you
what,
were a roller coaster expert.
low key I am. No,
Okay.
I'm not. But yeah, the Knott's Berry Farm was I did that one of my first couple of trips to America. Very defining experience for me.
Yeah, it's a fun one.
Yeah, it really is. All right, to our audience, thank you for joining us, and thank you, David, for doing your first podcast.
Thank you for having me.
For anyone who would like to read David's awesome story on Six Flags, please reach out to us at podcast@9fin.com. Hope to see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Sasha.
Thank you, David.